Thank you so much, and welcome to the press conference. My name is Rachel Haynes. I'll be moderating for today. Today's speakers, we have Benjamin Roebuck and Mariam Musse from the Federal Ombudsperson for Victims of Crime Office. Following the remarks, we'll head to the room for a question and answer period, and we will take any questions from Zoom if we have any. Just before we start, if you are using an earpiece today, please make sure that when you're not using it, you put it on the sticker in front of you so that we can protect the health and safety of our interpreters and avoid any interference and feedback. And with that, I will pass it over to our speakers.
Thank you. Good morning, bon matin. Today, on Human Rights Day, we pause to reflect on the fundamental rights and freedoms that belong to all people and the ongoing work required to uphold them. As we gather, I want to acknowledge that we're on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who've cared for this land since time immemorial. We honor the deep history and culture and contributions of Indigenous peoples to this land and recognize the injustices they've endured, including state-perpetrated hate crime and systemic violation of human rights. In the spirit of reconciliation and human rights, our report emphasizes the urgent need to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and 230 calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Additionally, we call for measures to counter the denial of harm caused by the Indian residential school system. As we commemorate Human Rights Day, let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder of our collective responsibility to confront hate, uphold justice, and work towards a future where all people and communities can live with dignity and safety. Thank you for joining us today as we release our special report on strengthening access to justice for victims of hate crime in Canada. I'm proud to be here with Mariam Musse, our policy lead, who led this project with support from Aisling McCoy. And I'm very happy to share the stage as well with other Canadian leaders working hard to prevent and reduce hate in all its forms. Mohammed Hashim, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, Amira Elghawaby, Canada's Special Representative for combating Islamophobia, and earlier we were joined by Amy Wise, representing Canada's Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. The Office of the Federal Ombudsperson has a mandate to improve access to federal programs and services for victims of crime, help policymakers understand systemic issues that negatively affect survivors, and ensure that the quasi-constitutional provisions in the Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights are upheld. Why this? Why now? Hate crimes reported to the police in Canada are at the highest levels that we've seen. Still, we know that most people affected already experience discrimination and do not report to police because of mistrust, fear. They don't believe it will help, and they want to avoid further stigma on themselves and their communities. When the justice system fails survivors consistently, it validates hate and feelings of exclusion. We're here today because we believe that can change. Pourquoi c'est là? Pourquoi maintenant? Les crimes haineux signalés à la police au Canada sont au niveau les plus élevés que nous avons vus. Et nous savons que la plupart des personnes qui sont ciblées sont déjà victimes de discrimination et ne le signalent pas à la police en raison de méfiance, de la peur, la croyance que rien ne changera et le désir d'éviter d'être davantage stigmatisées pour elles-mêmes et la communauté. Lorsque le système judiciaire échoue systématiquement envers les survivantes, il valide la haine et le sentiment d'exclusion. Nous sommes ici aujourd'hui parce que nous croyons que ça peut changer. Mariam Musse, who leads our policy team and is pretty awesome, will provide more context on our study.
Okay, thank you for coming, and thank you, Dr. Roebuck, for your commitment to show federal leadership to address hate, and again to our guests for coming and for their leadership as well. So the findings of this report are based on a mixed method approach, including survey responses from 187 police and victim service organizations representing a diverse range of urban, rural, and remote communities. So we interviewed academic partners and community leaders and reviewed existing research on the needs of survivors, statistical trends, and legislative options. The report includes a case study offering insight into the long-term and wider impacts of hate crime incidents on victims and their communities. We conclude with recommendations and a list of resources we identified throughout the study, including toolkits, practice guides, and online reporting apps. Le rapport comprend une étude de cas qui donne un aperçu des répercussions des crimes haineux à long terme et plus vaste sur les victimes et leur communauté. Nous concluons par des recommandations et une liste de ressources que nous avons cernées tout au long de l'étude, y compris une trousse d'outils, des guides de pratique et des applications de signalement en ligne. We started before the Online Harms Act was introduced, so we were able to ask for feedback on measures proposed in Bill C-63. This is what we heard. First, underreporting to police remains a significant barrier. Victims of hate crime face immense challenges in coming forward. Fear of retaliation, systemic racism, and mistrust of law enforcement discourage many from reporting. When reports are made, police in our study estimated that only 35% of victims access the support services they need. The disconnect between reporting and support highlights the lack of a cohesive system to guide victims from incident to resolution. Third-party reporting through organizations or victim services is a promising practice for gathering more accurate statistics, reporting to police, and making referrals. Second, we need specialized resources for survivors of hate crime. Only 28% of police respondents said their police services had a dedicated hate crime unit. Nearly half of those units are staffed by just one officer. We heard that hate crime units have greater access to specialized training on recognizing and investigating hate crime and are better equipped to conduct meaningful community outreach and education. Third, we need a clear definition of hate crime in the criminal code to improve investigations. Police reported difficulties navigating inconsistent definitions, distinguishing hate speech from freedom of expression, and knowing how to assess motivation for hate crime. Perpetrators of online hate are often shielded by anonymity and enabled by platforms that lack accountability measures. Fourth, there is a pressing need for improved training across all sectors. Police wanted practical training on online hate crime investigation techniques, since most officers have limited experiences with cases. Police recommended hybrid learning opportunities and interagency workshops led by experienced hate crime units. Victim service organizations also want specialized training, but struggle with funding and resource constraints. And finally, there were mixed responses to proposed legislative reforms. There was strong support for a standalone hate crime offense, as proposed in Bill C-63. 77% of police and 82% of victim services said it would be either helpful or very helpful, but that it would require investment in training to be effective. Respondents were less supportive of peace bonds and felt that the requirement for Attorney General consent would introduce barriers to timely prosecution. So I'll invite Dr. Roebuck back to speak to the recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariam. Canada has to protect its people from violence that targets who we are. This report is a call to action. We make 13 recommendations to improve responses to hate crime. The Canadian Victims' Bill of Rights needs to be strengthened and has to play a central role in Canada's action plan on combating hate. Victims of crime need enforceable rights to information, participation, and protection. This is even more critical for groups that mistrust the criminal justice system. Les victimes d'actes criminels ont besoin de droits exécutoires. Le droit à l'information, à la participation et à la protection doivent être respectés. C'est encore plus critique pour les groupes qui se méfient déjà du système de justice pénale. Nous avons besoin d'investir dans la prévention et la formation, et il nous faut des meilleurs outils pour faire un suivi des crimes haineux. We need investment in prevention and training and better tools for tracking hate crime. We need to hold large multinational corporations accountable for hate facilitated through their online products, so the lives of people in Canada are prioritized over profit. We need to uproot hate in Canada by taking action on recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and 2S LGBTQI+ people. And we need a clear definition of hate in the criminal code to protect survivors and protect our freedom of speech. Everyone in Canada deserves to be safe and have access to justice, no matter who they love, how they look, where they come from, the language they speak, or the faith they follow. Everyone matters and everyone belongs. Nous tous au Canada méritons d'être en sécurité et d'avoir accès à la justice, peu importe qui ils aiment, à quoi ils ressemblent, d'où ils viennent, la langue qu'ils parlent ou la foi qu'ils suivent. Tout le monde compte et tout le monde a sa place. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you. We'll start the question period now. If you are joining online, please take this time to raise your hand. We will start in the room. I'll start with Hélène Brizetti.
Oui, bonjour. Ma question est pour Madame Elghawaby. Vous avez certainement entendu les commentaires de François Legault récemment. J'aimerais savoir ce que vous pensez de cette interdiction à laquelle il songe de la prière en public.
Merci pour votre question, Hélène. C'est une question pour les élus du Québec en parler avec les communautés qui vont être impactées par ces propositions.
Oui, mais quand même, vous êtes la représentante pour l'islamophobie. Tout le monde dit que ça vise l'islam. Je ne peux pas croire que vous n'avez pas d'opinion sur le sujet.
On a déjà entendu de beaucoup de communautés religieuses minoritaires pour ces idées. Alors, c'est pour les Québécois, pour en discuter, ça va leur impacter, comment ça va leur impacter. Yeah, so thanks, Rafi. The discussion around preventing prayers in public spaces that's happening in Quebec is really a conversation that Quebecers are going to have, and we've already started to hear from various religious communities about how that will impact them, considering that there are many religious communities that do have activities in public, including Catholic, Jewish, along with Muslim communities. So the broader impact of suggesting to potentially override the Charter of Rights and Freedoms for this proposal will have to be a discussion that happens in Quebec.
Thank you. And Rafi, for your questions.
Sure, thank you. For Dr. Roebuck, I guess the NDP has this private members bill that would punish residential school deniers with up to 2 years imprisonment. Is this the kind of thing you have in mind when you are recommending legislation against residential school denialism?
Residential schools have profoundly affected Indigenous peoples, and it's unconscionable to think that that harm would be denied. We don't comment on punitive legislation or legislation that's focused on specific penalties in the criminal code. We focus on rights and services for victims of crime.
And this next question, I would have liked to ask it to Deborah Lyons as well as Amira Elghawaby, but I know Deborah is not here, though she was advertised to be here. As you know, there is currently a Foreign Affairs Committee studying a two-state solution for the Canadian government, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how the Canadian government recognizing a Palestinian state might impact Islamophobia or Muslim-related hate crimes in Canada.
So thanks for your question, Rafi. So all I will say, considering that I have a domestic mandate, is that certainly the tensions and the violence that's been happening in Gaza has had deep and profound impacts on rising Islamophobia, rising anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Arab hate, along with rising anti-Semitism in this country. And so these discussions that are happening on Parliament do have an impact on our communities, particularly when many in our communities feel that the discourse has largely been dehumanizing of Canadian Palestinians, Arabs and Muslims. And so I think it's going to be very important that elected officials take that into consideration as they have these very sensitive conversations that impact particularly on the Canadian Palestinian community.
Thank you. Stephanie Levitz?
Hi there. Thanks for this. I note that you've framed the report in the context of the rise in hate crimes due to the geopolitical events since October the 7th of last year. You reference an MOU between the special representatives, two offices. I notice there is a case study in the report that deals specifically with anti-Muslim crime, and I'm sorry that that happened to you, but there's nothing referencing anti-Semitism explicitly, and I'm wondering why that is.
Thank you. That's a good question. We obviously care deeply about how people are affected by anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and other forms of hate. There's a lot that's happening geopolitically, and we didn't want the report to particularly focus on those issues, but to really try and dig into what are the supports that are necessary for victims of crime right now in Canada. And so we've tried to cover a wide range of issues. It wasn't intentional to avoid any topics, but we did want to look at some of the really important cases that were coming forward, and also raise the profile of hate crimes against people who are homeless, and anti-Asian hate, and hate against people who are older, and femicide. And so there's a broad range of issues covered in the report.
One of the things we often hear, or we've been hearing a lot of, I suppose, in the last several months, is that existing laws are not being enforced that would support victims of crime, and that, you know, police are really shying away from engaging. I wonder if you could reflect on that, and how, in terms of your consultations with police and others, what you heard about those barriers, as opposed to we need more laws, more regulations. We have laws. There's a perception they're just not being used.
So we've definitely heard that the existing laws are not being used and could be used more effectively. And at the same time, we've heard from police that there's a lack of clarity in the existing laws that could be more clear to help guide investigations and prosecutions. There's different ways to approach it in legislation, but the respondents to our study were asking for more clarity in how it's framed in the criminal code and how it could be applied.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question as well. I would just like to know why Deborah Lyons isn't here with you today, even though she was advertised to be.
Thank you. I apologize for that. Ami Wise was attending for Deborah, and we were running late, and he wasn't able to stay for the duration. So unfortunately, when we organized, you know, we've done the best that we can to gather. I'm really grateful for Amira and Mohammed for being here, and her office did participate and gave feedback on the report, and have been a good partner with us.
All right. Thank you. I don't currently have any more questions online, but if you have time, I'd like to go back to the floor for Steph.
I just want to come back to the case study, and I wonder if you could speak, Ms. Musse, about the irony of your experience, given where you work, and then what it was that you ran into.
Yeah, so like I won't go over it in details, but I will say that, you know, the reason that I went there, where, you know, examining and really learning from the experiences of the families and the survivors, and the impact of hate on the wider community in London, specifically to hear from the victim impact statements and the community impact statements to help inform our work. Going there at that time, I didn't expect that would happen to me. I don't think anybody expects that. I am super vigilant, but I think that it just demonstrates that, I don't know, just the irony of even being somebody that works in the field, somebody that's informed, and that took place while I was there, and it's really just the irony. It's just ironic.
Rafi, another
Sorry,
question.
can I just ask about Deborah Lyons' absence, because the news conference actually started exactly on time, and I'm wondering if her absence here doesn't have anything to do with the fact that anti-Semitism is not written about in this report.
No, I can't speak to Deborah's schedule specifically. Ami had done his very best to attend. He's the executive or the director for the office, so he was here, but wasn't able to stay. And
Yeah, and if I may, I'll just say that we updated the news release. We sent an updated version with Ami's name, and maybe that was not sent out in time, but we did do that on our side.
But I can say that it's not for a lack of support for the work, and that we've collaborated and spoken, and we're all working together to address hate.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, then we will. That'll conclude the press conference. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.